Alrighty, let's go ahead and get started for this evening. So my name is Andrew Felton. I work with the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District. And tonight we are putting on our very first ever Weed Wrangling 101 webinar. We'll be talking a little bit about how to manage weeds and then also offering some tips and tricks on ways that you can go about managing these weeds on any space that you might live at or manage. Before we get started, I do want to just go over a couple of housekeeping items. We are recording tonight's presentation, as many of you just heard, and we will be posting it on our YouTube channel sometime early next week. We'll also be sending out a follow-up email to everyone who has registered for the webinar. In that email, you will get a copy of the presentation slides, as well as a shared folder with a ton of different resources on helping manage invasive species and weeds. So don't feel like you won't see these presentation slides anymore. You will get a copy of them that you can reference in the future. At the very bottom of your screen, you'll see two icons. One icon will be a chat icon, and the other will be a Q&A icon. If you want to run into any technical issues as we're going through today, please feel free to message me, and I'm more than happy to troubleshoot with you. If you do have any questions during the webinar tonight, feel free to add those to that Q&A panel. We will have time at the very end of the presentation tonight to answer any of those questions that you might have, and we'll just go through those on a first come, first serve basis. So if you have a question at any point, feel free just to add it, and we will make sure that we cover it along the way. At the very end of the presentation tonight, you will see a prompt to complete a survey. If you wouldn't mind just taking a couple of minutes to fill out that survey, it's a huge help in us in developing these webinars that we offer, especially with this one, since this is our very first time offering this particular presentation. So let's go ahead and dive in. So as I mentioned, I work for a conservation district. We do like to spend at least one slide talking a little bit about conservation districts because many people don't know what they are. Conservation districts are what's known as a special district, so a little bit like a library or a fire department. But instead of lending books or putting out fires, we help communities conserve natural resources. Natural resources like soil, water, plants, as well as wildlife habitat. And we do that through a variety of ways. We offer education programs like the one that you're joining right now. We also offer technical assistance. So we provide advice on how to manage weeds or how to start a native plant garden. We even have specialists that can come out and visit the site that you work at or live and be able to talk a little about any natural resource related issue that you might be facing. So if you'd like to speak into any of the specialists that you'll be hearing from tonight, we have folks that can come out and actually talk to you on site and really dive deeper into the issues that you might be facing. We also offer financial assistance, and we do that through grants as well as direct financial aid. So if you are a teacher that wants to start a school garden, we can help provide funding to start that. Or if you are a part of a community organization that wants to start a community garden, we have grants that can help pay to start those sorts of offerings. Likewise, if you are an individual and you wanted to install a rain garden or a rain cistern or even just a native plant garden, we have funding sources that can help pay for some of those different types of projects. Now, I mentioned earlier that I work for the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District. Our focus area is Washington County, which is just west of the Portland metro area. But there is a conservation district for just about every county across the United States. So whether you live in Washington County or you live somewhere else, I want to encourage you to look up your conservation district because many of them offer programs like what we have and can help resolve any natural resource related issue you might be facing. So with further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to our presenters to introduce themselves and we'll get started for the evening. Tyler, take it away.
Thank you, Andrew. My name is Tyler Pedersen. I'm the Invasive Species Program Coordinator at Tualatin SWCD.
I'm Olivia Hurd, the Invasive Species Technician at Tualatin SWCD. And my name's Eli Staggs. I am also an invasive species technician at Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District.
Okay, I just want to give you a little background about our invasive species program. We provide advice on controlling common weeds like we're going to be doing today in this presentation. We do survey and control of what we call early detection and rapid response weeds and pests throughout the Tualatin River watershed. We have a tool library of weed wrenches that we loan out to landowners in the Washington County. And these weed wrenches can help remove plants, invasives like Scotch broom, English holly, English hawthorn, types of shrubs and trees like those. And then lastly, we provide these weed watcher workshops for communities. So much like the one that you're seeing today. And then we'll also mention some others that are coming up later in April and May at the end of the presentation. So these are some of the workshop goals for tonight. First one is essentially just understanding botany basics, kind of getting you more familiar with plants and the different types of plants out there and their different life cycles. The next one is to learn the process of weed wrangling. And then lastly, we're going to highlight a few common weeds and how to manage them. All right, so let's dive into the botany basics. So we've got different types of plants, and they all are different depending on their life cycles. And so this first one are the annuals. And so these are plants that complete their life cycle in 1 year. And these plants typically produce flowers and seeds very quickly. Usually we have the summer annuals, which complete their life cycle during the spring and summer. And then we have the winter annuals, which complete their life cycle during the fall and the winter. And you can see at the diagram there at the right, they go to seed, they grow, they flower, and then they die back, and that's all over the course of a year. The next type of plant life cycle are the biennials. So these are plants that require 2 years to complete their life cycle. So usually the biennials will take longer to produce flowers and seeds. During the first season, plants will produce leaves and roots. And then during the second season, plants will overwinter and then produce flowers, fruit, and seeds. And so some weeds don't always have a dormant period, and they'll still remain active. So this diagram at the right kind of changes depending on whether or not they're dormant as they go from 1 year to the next. And lastly, we have the perennials. So perennial plants usually live more than 2 years. They have robust root systems, and herbaceous perennials have soft stems that die back each winter, and the new stems will regrow each spring. And then the woody perennials, like trees and shrubs, have woody stems that withstand cold winter temperatures. And you can see there at the diagram at the right, the perennials, they're just kind of continually going through the growth, seeding, dying back, seeding again. And so that happens over more than 2 years. So these plants are more robust and they can take longer to control. So these are different ways that weeds can grow and spread. So at the far left there are seeds. And so usually seeds can spread by wind, water, animals, and humans. They can be short-lived or long-lasting in the soil. In the middle there, we have stolons. And so these are different vines or growths that run along the ground to form new plants. Many can creep along quickly, and others will take longer to grow along. And then on the far right, there are rhizomes. And these are continuously growing underground roots. And they can grow horizontally and start new plants. And they can be shallow or deep, or short or long. Okay, so what is a weed? So just going to run through some of the terminology to get you familiar with the different types of weeds, and also kind of differentiate between native, non-native, invasive, and noxious weeds. So first of all, what is a weed? So this is any plant that grows in an unwanted place. This can be especially in gardens or fields where it prevents desired plants from growing. Okay, so terminology. So the first one here is native. So these are plants that are have historically occurred in a place. They're also called indigenous. Non-native. So these are plants that have not historically existed in a place, but have been introduced due to human activity. Invasive plants. These are non-native plants that spread rapidly and harm humans, the environment, or the economy. Give you some examples here. So plants that could harm humans, toxic weeds like poison hemlock. An example of a weed that can kind of provide or can cause environmental harm. Blackberry, which can often degrade wildlife habitat and reduce biodiversity. And then the last one, economic harm. So these are weeds that can reduce the productivity of crops or forage for livestock. And a good example would be tansy ragwort. And then lastly, we have noxious weeds. So this is a plant designated by federal, state, or local government agencies as harmful to public health, agricultural, recreation, wildlife, or property. And this is a great infographic that kind of shows how invasive plants can damage habitat, biodiversity, and infrastructure. So you can see at the far left there, that is a healthy ecosystem. And as you go all the way over to the far right there, you can see how those invasive plants are, damaging habitat, biodiversity, reducing the native plants and now competing them. And then they're damaging infrastructure like the foundations around your house. And so that's why we're trying to get on these, control these weeds early on before they can cause all these detrimental impacts.
All right. So now we're going to move into discuss the process of weed wrangling, which was one of the goals that we had for this presentation. And this is about providing you all with a framework for controlling weeds. So no matter what circumstances you have or what plant you have, you can apply these questions and these ideas to those circumstances that you might have. With weed wrangling, the strategy, there are different approaches to weed control, and those different approaches are needed based on the plant that you're trying to control and the site conditions that you have. And so our idea of weed wrangling is broken into 3 phases with questions that we would ask ourselves along the way to guide our strategy. First, we ask ourselves in the first place why we want to get rid of a particular plant. And when we ask ourselves why we want to get rid of our plant, we want to try to set our expectations about whether or not we want full eradication, or we are able to tolerate a little bit of that plant, or whatever our expectations might be about control. After asking ourselves that, we would move into researching the plant and finding out as much as we can about this plant as we can. And finally, we'll revisit our original question of why we want to remove the plant and our expectations, and develop our plan of control based on the research we conducted. So we'll start by discovering our why. And there are many reasons why we might want to control a weed or a plant. Weeds can be an eyesore, they could harm ourselves or our loved ones, or they could even threaten our livelihood. But why we want to control a plant also influences our tolerance threshold for that plant. And a tolerance threshold is the maximum presence of a weed that you could put up with. And this is going to be different for everybody. It's going to be different based on the plant that you're controlling and whatever scenario you have. And part of this tolerance threshold and why we want to control a weed brings us into setting our expectations. And it's important early on to set our expectations for weed control. You want to evaluate the amount of time, effort, and resource that you yourself can invest to control that particular weed. And so that once we assess all of those, that time, effort, and resources, this can guide our realistic expectations for maybe how quickly and how effectively you could manage an infestation of weeds that you have. So after asking ourselves our why, we move into researching the plant. There are 4 key pieces of information we want to learn about a weed when we're going to move into controlling it. First and most importantly, we need to learn the plant's common and scientific names. Learning the correct identity of a plant opens up all the doors for finding the answers to all the questions we might have about that weed. And with correct identification, we can learn the life cycle of a plant, all of its uses and impacts, and any treatment methods that that plant might respond to. So first step of research is getting the plant identification down. Like I mentioned, proper identification of a weed is critical, and we definitely recommend you learn the scientific name of a plant as well as its common name when you research, because some plants share or have similar common names, which can make tracking down the right information confusing. And also sometimes weeds have lookalikes that are actually native to our area, and we want to ensure we don't accidentally remove any native plants that we might want to keep. And so listed here are some great resources for nailing down the correct identity of a plant. With the names of our plants that we're trying to control nailed down, we can move into learning about a plant's life cycle. And Tyler helped us learn the basics of plant life cycles so we can use that information to formulate our treatment plans. Rather than choosing to pull a weed or spray a weed whenever we feel like it, we can carry out the best control when we work around a plant's life cycle. And part of a plant's life cycle is its method of reproduction. We want to know when our plant flowers so we can time our weed control around that most of the time. In most cases, the best time to conduct any treatment is before a plant has the chance to flower and produce seed. And learning how long a plant's seeds can remain viable in a soil can tell us how long we might need to monitor that infestation after we conduct any control measures on them. Some plants have seeds that can remain viable in the soil for 50 years. So when we go back to our original question of why and our expectations, sometimes it's important to think back as we're researching and we're learning about these weeds to revisit those expectations. If we have to monitor a site for many years, very quick, instant gratification control might not happen. And also part of how it reproduces, Tyler taught us about stolons and rhizomes. Those are plant structures that allow a plant to reproduce without having to produce any flowers or set seed. And so if plants use stolons or rhizomes, we'll need to make sure that we remove all parts of the plant, and we need to be very careful with how we dispose of that material. Stolons and rhizomes are great at starting new plants if these parts of the plant are not properly disposed of in a tied plastic bag in the garbage. And also, if a plant that we were trying to control has a robust root system, that can tell us how resilient this plant might be to our control efforts. And so some plants are going to require significantly more effort in terms of their control than others to eradicate or bring their populations levels down. That's what we need to know about their life cycle. And we're introducing this idea of learning about a plant's uses and impacts. And so looking back at some of the terminology that we covered at the beginning of the presentation about what is a weed, or what is native and what is not native, what is noxious. We're not painting everything, we're not painting the same thing in different lights. These differentiations are important to acknowledge because every plant has a nuance to them and how they impact the area around them. So we might sometimes actually have negative assumptions about a plant that we're trying to get rid of before we research their benefits and impacts. But that's not to say most of the time when we identify a weed in our area, we have good reason to. It's just always a good idea to kind of check ourselves and assess how might this plant provide some benefit, especially if we're unfamiliar with that particular plant. So here's a list of examples of some uses and impacts. We could find out, does it produce berries? Sometimes berries are edible, and that's really great. But other times those berries might be edible and toxic at the same time, which is not necessarily a good thing, especially if we have pets or little kids around, or even me. I'm kind of tempted sometimes. And we can find out, does the plant attract pollinators or does it attract pests? English ivy is great habitat for rats to hang out sometimes, and that's not particularly great. Does the plant fit in with your landscaping, or does it take over wherever you've planted it? Does this plant provide forage for your livestock out in fields, or does it restrict forage for your livestock? Does it impede their access, or is it dominating the desirable foliage that you want them to be grazing on? And then this, does the plant benefit your neighbors, or does it impact your neighbors? Are you planting a plant for privacy that is going to remain in place and it's going to keep your privacy between you and your neighbor, or are you going to have something growing over on top of their fence and you might need to trim back every so often? These are good things to ask ourselves when we decide the uses and impacts of what we're trying to control. And then finally, part of our research are learning about the treatment options, and this is the final stage of our weed wrangling strategy. When researching treatment options, there are many questions to ask that can be categorized by effort, time, and resources. When we're thinking about the effort of treatment, we need to know how big is this infestation. This might decide, okay, can I hand pull all of these? Or am I going to need to till, or am I going to need to mow? How quickly has this infestation spread? Do I need to get on this right now and put a lot of effort in? And what type of removal does this plant need? Does it respond to just hand pulling? Does it respond to mowing? Does it respond to tilling? Or am I going to need to use other methods of control on top of that? Then we need to think about the time. If we have a tolerance threshold of 0, we need to have this plant completely eradicated. Learning about treatment methods will tell us how long that's going to take. So learning the life cycle, how long until it's gone forever, and then treatment, how long is it going to take for this plant to respond to the treatment method that we put? Say we hand pulled, it's out of the ground immediately, or if we mowed, is it going to die right away, or is it going to persist through the rest of the season after we mow it? And then again, like I mentioned earlier, this is in here again, how long do those plant seeds last? How long am I going to need to revisit this infestation to make sure that the plant is entirely gone if I have a 0 tolerance threshold? And then the resources, when we're researching treatment options, is important to think and learn about. What tools or equipment are we going to need to remove this plant? And do I have those resources available? Do I have those tools and equipment to treat it myself? And then if it's a very large infestation and I might not be able to take care of it myself, is there anyone that can help me take care of an infestation? And sometimes our neighbors are our best resources, because oftentimes if we have a weedy species, our neighbors might as well. And so that's a good opportunity to knock on their door and say, hey, I've got this problem and maybe you do too. We could work on this together. So we're talking about treatment options, and this is an infographic showing off the integrated pest management pyramid. This shows the multiple methods of control that you can use when controlling a weed. Integrated, just emphasizing the fact that you won't be able to just use one of these methods. Oftentimes you're using multiple at once. And you can see how each method has a smaller and smaller chunk, and that corresponds to how much focus of energy you should put into putting into using that method. Prevention being one of the most important. You should be thinking about prevention all of the time. And then chemical is one of those options that might be a last resort, and you should be thinking about that last before you try to investigate these other options available to you. So starting with prevention, the biggest chunk of that pyramid, here are some methods of prevention that you can use and implement yourself. Using boot brushes, personal small ones are good to keep in your car, or a boot brush station when they're available are always important to make sure that you're not spreading the seeds or plant fragments around to new sites. And that's how a lot of new infestations of weeds are started. If you are landscaping a garden or planting an area, research what you're buying. Some nurseries will sell plants that spread super quickly, and you might end up with a problem that you didn't realize you were going to have. So if you research your plant list ahead of time, you might learn a lot about what you end up putting in the ground. And then also, as part of, while you're managing an infestation, you're mowing down something, or you're using a shovel to dig out a plant, you should clean those tools after visiting those infested areas so you don't inadvertently spread it to a new area. And then pests and weeds aren't necessarily just about plants. We have insects and animals that can be invasive to our area. So just as a reminder to everybody, don't move firewood. If you're going camping, you should go buy firewood from the area that you're going to be camping at, because though wood from our area can carry invasive insects and diseases to new locations. The new buzz that's happening is we have emerald ash borer in our area, so that's something to be very conscious of. And then also not dumping our aquariums. Our aquarium pets and plants might be great in the house, but they are not good to bring and introduce to our natural ecosystems, because they can carry diseases and pathogens themselves, or they could start new populations that are going to compete with our desirable native friends. After prevention, cultural control is the intentional manipulation of a plant's environment to control their population. You can plant bare areas with desirable vegetation, also cover cropping to make sure that weeds aren't introduced. You could implement fire when it's appropriate. Propane torches can be used to manage some weeds, but if you have something that's toxic, like to your skin, I wouldn't recommend burning poison oak. Having those fumes in the air would not be good for your lungs or maybe your neighbors. I wouldn't recommend. So be cautious when you're interacting with toxic plants. And you can use livestock to help reduce weed populations. Sometimes we have weeds or undesirable vegetation that is actually palatable and non-toxic to livestock, so we can introduce our animal friends to eating those weeds, and that can be very helpful. And then you could also sheet mulch, and that can help to remove all plants in an area while also building soil at the same time. So those are some cultural controls, some ways that you can manipulate the environment around you to reduce weed populations. And then after cultural, we have physical and mechanical as a method of removing weeds. That's going to involve things that we're probably all familiar with, which is just hand pulling, being out in the garden and using our hands to pull weeds out. We can dig with tools, little spades and shovels. We could use mowing to remove the top growth of plants, because sometimes plants respond to and will die after being mowed. You could plow and remove all the roots and lift them up and out of the soil. Some plants respond to mowing and plowing, but also this is a good reminder of, as our research, you should think about, does the plant respond to mowing or plowing? Sometimes there are weeds, especially if they have rhizomes, where mowing or plowing can just encourage new growth. It might strengthen the infestation. So have that in mind when you're researching. And then you can also use a weed wrench, especially if maybe you just moved to a property or there's an area that you haven't been to yet, where there are some larger established weeds that you want to get rid of, like holly or hawthorns. Those are tools where it's shown in the bottom photo here, where you can use leverage as to an advantage to get rid of those plants. And if you live in Washington County, those are available for loan for free through us at the district. So if you want to get more information on that, you can visit our website. And then one last thing to note, sometimes, we're not all perfect. There might be a weed population that we can't get to right away, but we want to make sure it doesn't spread. And we see that it's gone to flower. One thing we can do is remove those flower heads before they can set seed. This is also called deadheading, and that's a way to handle weed populations. Next is biological control. This is a method of control that is not necessarily used to eradicate populations. These are natural enemies of the plants from their native areas that can help just keep populations to a level where they're not going to dominate an entire landscape. And so that means some years are going to be better than others. Just as these biological controls need food, and their food is the weed. So if they eat all of their food, then that means the biological controls are going to go away, which is not good for them. So they're trying to always maintain a balance. And so that's going to create a cyclical nature where some years, like with tansy ragwort, there is going to be a moth where, that moth is going to need a lot of tansy, it's going to eat it, and then the population is going to go down, which means then the population of the moth goes down, which then allows tansy to boom. So it's going to boom bust like that, but that's intentional. And you might see those. And if you want to know if a biological control is available or out there existing, you should contact and consult with your local extension office about that. And finally, there's chemical control. Chemical control is one of those last resort options for weed control. And so some things to know when you're considering chemical is to always research what you're using beforehand. We make a note in here that organic doesn't always necessarily mean better than synthetic. Sometimes organics are great options, and then sometimes you might need to consider other, and that's up for you to decide and for on what you're comfortable with using. And always start with the least toxic product available. Just because you can hit it with the hardest and hottest mix you can doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be good for controlling the plant or the environment around us. And sometimes they only provide short-term control, which isn't in our best interest when we want to completely eradicate a plant. And when you are going to use a more toxic product as a last resort, make sure to research the impacts of any off-target, if there's a chance of an off-target impact, you should know about those ahead of time. And you should always read the label of these chemicals that you apply. Always wear personal protective equipment. We need to make sure we have our gloves, long sleeves on, and closed-toed shoes, the long pants, things to make sure that we're not coming into direct contact with the chemicals. And when in doubt, or even if you think you are, it's a good idea to consult with your local extension office or your conservation district. You can contact us about chemical questions, and we'd be very happy to answer anything and provide guidance for you. And so now we have researched our methods, we are understanding our why, we can finally take action. We know what control options are available to us. So what we want to do is revisit our original expectations. We've learned so much about what kind of treatments these plants respond to and how quickly that's going to take. So our original expectations might now have changed as we've learned, or they may have stayed the same. So we'll ask ourselves, do we need these full eradication? Maybe the uses and impacts has led us to learn that maybe we should keep a couple around and we're okay with having some, or the impacts are just far too great and we need to get rid of everything. And then we also will ask ourselves, how long is this going to take? What tools or equipment do I have? And am I going to need outside help? And that's going to change our expectations. And with that, we can develop our concrete plan, identifying our treatment methods, knowing when to treat, and creating a timeline for how we're going to conduct all of this treatment, and then calling for assistance.
All right, so we did build in a little bit of a pop quiz into tonight's presentation, just to kind of go over some of the material that we just covered, because that's really the bulk of it. We will also cover some species highlights in just a second here. So I'm going to go ahead and launch a quiz. This is not graded by any stretch of the imagination. We will cover the answers. So if you want to just fill out these questions to the best of your knowledge, we will cover the answers after everyone has inputted. So question number 1 is, what is the foundation of the IPM pyramid? Is it cultural, prevention, physical and mechanical, biological, or chemical? Question number 2 is an example question. So this is a herbaceous plant that flowers in the summer, but the stems die back in the winter, and then new growth starts each spring. So what type of life cycle does this plant have? Is it an annual, biennial, or perennial? What is the correct order of weed wrangling or weed management? Is it research, discovery, or take action, discover, research, and take action, or take action, research, and discover? Another question of using weed wrenchers is an example of what type of weed control? Is it prevention, physical and mechanical, cultural, biological, or chemical? And then the final question is, all weeds require chemical control. Is that true or false? So I see answers coming in. I'll go ahead and wait a few more minutes for folks to have a chance to input their answers before I end the poll and launch the results for all of us to see. All right, last call for any answers. So if you're still working, go ahead and submit them along the way. All right, let's go ahead and close up the poll, and I'm going to share our results. So the answer to question 1, what is the foundation of the IPM pyramid? It is prevention. That is correct. Good job, everyone out there. The plant that's described above is the plant that grows in the summer or flowers in the summer, stems die back in the winter, and then it returns each spring. That is a perennial. The correct order of weed wrangling is discovery, research, and take action. Great work there. Using weed wrenches is a type of physical and mechanical control. Spot on, 100%. Great job, everyone. And finally, that is correct. That is false, that all weeds do not require chemical control. Well, thank you for indulging us in a little pop quiz there. And we will hand it back over to Olivia.
Okay, so now we're going to do some weed highlights, some of those common weeds that you guys might have in your property. So the first plant we're going to start with is blackberry. I know many of you probably have blackberry in your yard or near your property, and you can see how bad it can become, and it can happen pretty quickly. So if blackberry is left unchecked, these sorts of invasive situations can get out of hand very quickly. So blackberry, it has green to brown stems with large curved thorns along the whole length. It can form very large thickets. The leaves usually have 5 leaflets. You can see in that bottom left photo that there's 5 leaflets. And our native blackberry has just 3, so it's a good differentiation. And those leaves are bright green on the top and light green underneath. In the summertime, they also begin to produce berries. The life cycle for blackberry, it is a perennial. It's long-lived and has a very strong and robust root system. It produces many seeds that are spread by wildlife, birds, and even humans. And one thing to think about blackberry is if any of those long stems touch the ground, they can reroot and start new populations or grow from those roots. Blackberry can attract both beneficial wildlife and pests. Those big berms of blackberry are good hiding spots for birds, but they're also good hiding spots for rats and mice and other things. They do produce edible berries, and they can restrict access for both you and other wildlife. So thinking about blackberry treatment. So thinking about cultural. If you reduce that bare ground, it makes it harder for the blackberry to take root. You can, once you remove the blackberry, if you can cover up that ground with lasagna mulching or other methods to improve your soil before you get something planted in there, that's the best way. Physical and mechanical, you can mow and then dig up those corms. The best thing to do is mow it and then dig them up so that you're not trying to battle those giant long stems of blackberry. They do have a pretty large root mass, and those large root masses or corms can hold all their energy. So even just mowing them back, those corms have all that energy and will send up new shoots later in the year. And then last is chemical. What we typically tell people is mow your blackberry first and then let it regrow 1 to 2 feet tall so that you're applying as little herbicide as possible, but you're also able to get rid of that blackberry. And if you are planning to do some mowing, we typically tell people not to do that mowing from April through August, because that's typically bird nesting season. And there's a lot of birds that really enjoy using those big blackberry berms because it does keep out other predators. So you can see here along the bottom that there's specific times of year that are best for those different methods. So we typically tell people to do chemical methods in April and May after you've done that mowing, or in September and October, waiting till the end of the summer when those leaves have gotten a little bit more moisture and that waxy coating that they develop as they dry out has washed away, or the leaves have opened up a little bit more to allowing that water to penetrate them. So the next species we're going to talk about is tansy ragwort. So here you can see how bad a tansy ragwort population can get. It can spread far and wide and have a huge impact. Tansy ragwort has ruffled looking leaves. You can see in that bottom left photo. The flower heads form flat-topped clusters of individual yellow flowers, and they're typically 2 to 4 feet tall. It is a biennial, and in its first year forms a rosette, and then the second year it bolts to produce those flowers, which typically happens in July through October. Those flowers produce a lot of seed that is spread by the wind and can blow many miles away. Especially if you're up on a hilltop, those seeds can spread far and wide. The impacts of tansy is it is very toxic to livestock. So thinking about that, if your neighbors have livestock, you may want to do a full eradication versus some of those other species that may not have as big of an impact if you have livestock living nearby. One thing to think about tansy is those seeds are viable for at least 10 years as well. So it's going to be a battle that you're going to have to take on for multiple years. So cultural, talk with your neighbors, see if you guys can work together to come up with a solution to help each other out with the spread of tansy ragwort. For physical and mechanical, mowing and tilling is not a great strategy because every time you mow it, that plant will just continue to produce flowers, just shorter and shorter. And at some point it will be short enough to even be missed by the mower. Hand pulling is a great strategy. It's best done when the soil is moist, and deadheading can work on those large patches before you apply herbicide. One thing to note about tansy is there is that cinnabar moth. You can see in that bottom photo, those are the caterpillars, and the caterpillars are actually what does the most damage. Those caterpillars typically come out, they emerge the second year. So they'll lay the eggs and then they overwinter and emerge and crawl up the plant, slowly making their way higher and higher in the plant. And once they make it to the top, they'll pupate and then become that moth that then flies off and goes and lays eggs and starts that cycle again. And last is chemical. It's best to treat in that rosette stage where you don't have to deal with those flowers yet, and you don't have to deal with all that stored energy because you're hitting it before it has a ton of time to store that energy in its roots. Herb Robert. I bet many of you have seen this plant around or even smelled this plant, also known as Stinky Bob. Herb Robert has light green leaves that are divided into 3 leaflets. The leaves turn dark red in the fall. It does produce a very strong odor when crushed, giving it the common name of Stinking Bob. It has hairy stems and small light pink flowers that have 5 petals. It is an annual or biennial. It can do both, and its seeds remain viable for 5 years. It does displace many native ground covers. It is aesthetically pleasing, but if you have to walk through an area, then you may not want to smell it all the time because it does produce quite the odor. And the seedlings can germinate any time of year and can produce flowers and seeds year round. So this is one that you have to be on all the time just to get it under control. For Herb Robert treatment, planting competitive plants is not super effective because it will just grow underneath them and around them. But after removing it, you can plant similar native plants in its place, like Pacific Bleeding Heart. And sheet mulching is pretty effective for this plant because it's so short that sheet mulching just blocks any light that gets to those seeds and can prevent it from coming up. Hand pulling small infestations is pretty effective. I have a few of those around and it's pretty effective at getting rid of it, although you do have to deal with that Stinky Bob smell. And you're just going to have to continue to monitor for those new sprouts. And mowing is not a good strategy because it will produce shorter and shorter, and you may inadvertently spread those seeds if it has any flowers on it. Next one is creeping thistle. I know this thistle can be anywhere, and you often see it in those unmaintained areas. So creeping thistle has lance-shaped leaves that grow alternate along the stem. The edges of the leaves have yellow spines. Its hairy stems can grow up to 5 feet tall. It has pink to purple flowers that grow in clusters at the end of each stem. It is a perennial, but it also reproduces by rhizomes and seeds, and the seeds can remain viable for 20 years. It competes with native plants and crops. It spreads pretty quickly and can grow in many habitats, though the stems can be peeled and cooked like asparagus or rhubarb. Haven't tried it, so I'm not sure how good it is, but it could be worth a try if you're trying to get rid of some of that thistle and don't want to throw it in the trash. For cultural, you can talk to your neighbors on how you can work together to reduce its spread. Propane torches can work pretty well to reduce that seed population, but just be aware of that maybe there's certain times of year that it might not be best to do that. Thinking about fire season and when the vegetation around you might be dried out. Physical and mechanical. Mowing isn't effective for this plant because it'll just grow and flower shorter and shorter. Hand pulling can work pretty well with some good leather gloves, but you got to make sure you have those good leather gloves or your hands are going to be in pain. And then chemical. It's best treated in its first year when it's growing as a rosette before it sends up those taller stems that go to flower. And the physical and mechanical, you can do that any time of year, but it's hard to get those rosettes out of the ground using that method without having to use a shovel or something else to get that taproot. When it starts to bolt, those taproots come out of the ground pretty easily when you just start to pull on them. So those are the 4 species. We have additional species that we would be happy to talk to you about, and we have lots of information in our weed and pest directory. And when we send out these slides, there will also be some diagrams like was in the blackberry on the best time of year for these different treatment methods. You can also check out the OSU extension Solve Pest Problems. The National Pesticide Information Center is a great resource. It's currently housed at Oregon State University, and there's people there that can answer phones or emails that you send their way, and they're happy to talk to anybody. A good resource if you're looking for native plants for your yard are native plants for the Willamette Valley yards. It's a great resource put out by Metro, and it has lots of great pictures in it as well. And then Grow Safe, Grow Smart is a good resource if you're looking for those less toxic ways, if you need to use chemicals for some of those pesky weeds out there. And then some next steps. So now that you've been through this training, take a walk around your space. What weeds do you have, and how do you want to wrangle them? Some additional options are you can attend naturescaping basics that will go over how you can naturescape in your own yard and what you can replace these invasives with. You can also attend a weed watcher workshop and learn about some of the priority invasive species in the Tualatin River watershed that we spend a lot of time focusing our efforts on. And those are available in person on April 12th at our office, May 10th in Forest Grove, and we're also doing an online presentation at the end of May.
Awesome. Thank you so much for taking us through those species highlights, Olivia. I know I wrote down a couple notes to take care of the herb Robert I have in my backyard, so I certainly appreciate it. So if any folks have any questions, now is a great time to go ahead and add those into the Q&A. We have had a few questions already asked, so I'm going to go ahead and start in, but feel free to keep on adding them, and we'll get to them as we go through. So I'm going to throw this question to Tyler. So the question is, our city maintains a monitored compost pile with yard waste, such that they now allow us to dispose of meat, fat, bones, etc. in their yard waste. Would such a pile be hot enough to kill toxic rhizomes and seeds, or do they still need to put it in a tightly closed bag in the garbage? Also, kind of a secondary question, at what level of noxiousness, somewhere between holly and English ivy, perhaps, does that answer change?
Yeah, that's a great question, Barbara. Yeah, so for compost, I mean, a lot of the weeds we talk about, we try to avoid putting them in the compost because it doesn't totally kill them off. Some examples, would be, like Western celandine, woody knotweed, garlic mustard, what other, probably like thistle, some of these plants that are gonna regenerate, in the compost pile, and spread. So I'm not sure if the temperature would be warm enough to kill them off. That's something that we've been kind of discussing too, like when we're bringing stuff to the dump. Some of the weeds that we're bringing, a lot of it is in bags, to make sure it's not gonna spread. So your second question, what level of noxiousness, somewhere between holly and English ivy, does the answer change? Yeah, I mean, for English ivy and holly, so both those can be, if you put them in compost, if they're not, especially for ivy, it's not totally dried out, it can still reroot and sprout. Same with holly. So probably not a good idea with those ones, but yeah, just in our experience. But some other weeds, it might be some annuals, if you've got like dandelions or things that don't have robust root systems, or like with celandine has these little tubers that can break off the roots and form new plants. So hopefully that answers your question.
Great, thank you so much, Tyler. The next question I'm going to throw to Olivia. So Olivia, Janice has two weeds that they have tried many methods to get rid of, and they still come back. So they have Himalaya blackberry that's growing through a fence that they share with a neighbor. That neighbor isn't interested in doing anything about them. The other plant is a trumpet vine that got out of control. So they cut it down, and then they unfortunately spread it throughout the yard. And they dug out what they thought was all of the roots and hauled off a ton of the soil, but it continues to come back. Do you have any suggestions on how to treat blackberry through a fence, as well as trumpet vine that keeps on coming back?
For that blackberry, if you can make your fence so that it's harder for that blackberry to grow through, that can help. But if your neighbor's not willing to do anything about it, maybe you could volunteer to cut it back on their side of the fence so that you can have a little bit longer time before it comes back, or even offer to help them dig it out. If they're not willing or able to do it themselves, sometimes offering to help them out, even though it's not in your property, sometimes that can help your neighborly relations as well. And then on that trumpet vine, man, those little pesky things, they've got all those little shoots and they can come back over and over, and every little piece of that vine can reproduce, making it kind of a pain to get rid of. You have to be persistent on top of that one. And or you could try some herbicide options. I would recommend, like, if you have like a paintbrush, you could paint it once you cut those vines to help kill anything that's underneath, and it limits the amount of herbicide that you're putting out on the ground. So you can just keep it to a very small amount, just painting it onto those stems once you cut the above ground material. Sometimes that can help reduce your population, and it will kill that underground without affecting anything around it. Hope that helps answer your question.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Olivia. I'm going to throw this question to Eli. So Eli, does the Tool Load program come with a brief tutorial on how to use the tools?
Yeah, so when you rent, or excuse me, when you rent a tool from us, we'll hand it off to you at our office. So it'll be in person and we can show you there how to use it, just to get yourself familiar with it. But then also we will be coming out with a video this spring showing off how to use a weed wrench. And yeah, there will be some online resource available through our website and our YouTube channel to see how a weed wrench is used in action. And then when you do choose to rent one with us, we can show you again in person and have a more personal one-on-one on how to use that tool. Absolutely.
Just a behind the scenes look. We filmed that video literally yesterday with Eli. So that's why I want to throw it to him. Next question I'll throw over to Tyler. So they tend to get a few small blackberry plants that pop up in different spots around the yard. Is there a way to find the source? They're popping up amongst a large tree with roots, so it makes digging really difficult.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I find I have kind of similar difficulty when I've dealt with it in my yard. So yeah, I mean, if you got some small blackberry plants popping up, sometimes, I mean, if it's the bigger stems, you can usually just fall back down to the source and be able to dig out the roots, but those tiny little ones are trickier because they're just starting to come up. They're new germinants, so they're newer plants. And if they are close, if they're among the tree roots, yeah, that can be difficult, because if they are new plants, they might be a little bit easier to dig up, but then you don't want to damage the tree roots. So you have to be pretty careful. You might have to be more meticulous. If you have like a, we use hori-horis. They're like this tool that kind of looks like a spade or a trowel. They just have a flat edge to it. And those can work pretty well, especially when the soil's moist. But yeah, you just got to be persistent and then just try to use, try to be meticulous if you can. I know you're probably concerned about the tree roots and not damaging that. So just kind of be mindful of how deep you're going and just be diligent trying to get those new plants as they come up.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tyler. I'm going to combine this next question into two. So I'll throw this over to Olivia. So the first question is, how do they get rid of celandine? And then the next question is, how do you remove celandine? They want to put their garden box in an area that they have physically removed many bulbs of celandine as they could, but they're worried that it might grow into the new boxes.
Yes, that is a very good worry and probably a worthy worry because celandine is very persistent. Although one thing that a neighbor of one of our staff members has tried is you can try some solarization. The one thing to think about there is you're going to need some plastic, some dark black plastic, and you're going to have to lay it down and leave it there for at least a year. And sometimes that can be a problem with where you are or where that area is. But if you can cover, if you're going to putting new garden boxes in, if you can cover that ground with some pretty thick landscape cloth, that might help prevent it from growing up into those garden boxes. But lesser celandine is a very pesky invasive, and we are hoping to do some herbicide trials in the coming years on that plant because we haven't found even a good herbicide that works really well to get rid of it. And for removing soil, it can be very difficult because you can break off any little one of those bulbs that can be teeny tiny, and you have a whole new population. So you kind of have to sift through all of the soil, sometimes even just throwing away a lot of that soil. So that can be one that is very pesky, invasive, and can be very difficult to remove. But we'll keep you posted as we come up with some herbicide options if those become options in the future.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that's definitely a difficult one, and one that is out and popping out. I'm seeing everywhere when I'm out walking my dog these days. So it's out there, especially this time of year. All right, I'll throw the next question to Eli. So what is the best way and time of year to remove English ivy that has been in place for several years? Are goats an option?
Yeah, so I like just how the question is asked in the first place because you're trying to understand, are there multiple ways of doing this? And you're considering how long it's been there. If ivy has been there for several years, it probably means that it's thick and it's well established, and just doing individual hand pulling might be very tedious and time consuming. The best time of year for English ivy removal is going to be between late fall and spring when the soil is moist and it's easiest to pull those roots and crawling vines out from the ground. If you're trying to do it in summer, you're probably going to break off above ground growth and you're not going to get to the things that are the root of the problem down below. So trying to time your control, whether you're doing physical, cultural, or chemical in the winter time is probably your best bet. I know that that's a miserable time to do it, but it will be the most effective. And the best way that I'd recommend for an English ivy, that population that's been around for a while, especially if you're trying to consider protecting desirable vegetation, because most of the time ivy is growing amongst desirable vegetation, are native ferns, or trees and shrub species. Using a mechanical way of removing ivy is great. Methods I've used in the past are using a machete and cutting out like big squares of ivy and cutting out a square, and then using like a stiff rake or a McLeod and pulling that square that you cut out and kind of making a burrito of that ivy as you pull it out of the ground is a great way to just protect any desirable vegetation. And then disposing of that material, not in the compost, in the garbage, but if you have a lot, then putting it on a tarp and leaving it to dry completely before disposing of it. Because if you leave ivy once that you've cut just on the ground, it'll reroot. So that's what I would just suggest. And the question of goats are an option. I mean, goats do eat almost anything. So that's another thing to consider. If you're introducing goats to an area, think about what other vegetation is there. Ivy will be palatable to goats, and it might also depend on your herd. Like every goat herd is going to be different on what they prefer, just like we have our own tastes. So goats might go for the ivy first and then your desirable vegetation last, or they might eat up all the really tasty desirable vegetation first and then go for the ivy last. So that's something to consider. But there is research that shows that and practical applications of goats eating ivy. So it is an option, but definitely some nuance with that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That's some really great ivy suggestions. The next question I will send over to Tyler. Is there any preferred environmentally friendly chemical for blackberry or ivy, or are all of them somewhat questionable?
Yeah, that's a great question, Robert. So yeah, for blackberry and ivy, there's nothing that we know of that's like an organic herbicide. That's certainly something that we're always on the watch for. But with a lot of those organic herbicides, they're more like contact herbicides. So essentially anything that they come in contact with, the top growth will die off, but then they'll still keep coming back because they don't kill off the roots. But in our field, with the restoration work, the chemicals that we use for blackberry and ivy could be glyphosate, triclopyr. Those are kind of the two main ones. I think that as long as they're done at the proper time of year, we're using low concentration, low volume, and it's not going to be like kind of this long-term treatment. It might be like a 2 to 3 years where you're doing treatments. I think in those cases they're not going to have very many environmental side effects. Of course, you want to read the label, make sure that chemical you're using is appropriate for the site that you're going to be managing the weeds on. But yeah, it's all about proper timing, using kind of a lower concentration, maybe trying to avoid, there's a lot of herbicides that you find at like Home Depot and Lowe's that are premixes. And so there are a lot of chemicals in there that you don't know of because they don't list them on there. Those are some things I always caution people about. It's better, like in our field, we try to use things that we know, if we're doing work near a creek, it's going to have a label for aquatic, that can be used around water. And we're always thinking about, when we're doing it, the time of year, and what other animals are doing, especially pollinators. So thinking about trying to treat something before it's in flower, and the bees and other pollinators are going to be on it. So I think kind of factoring all those things in, you just want to make it, you can make it a lot safer. Not to say that it's entirely safe, but you just need to be aware of all those different factors.
Great. No, that's some really great advice. And, always know that there's experts out there to help you. So whether that's your conservation district or your local extension office, if you have a question about it, it's an easy call or email away. I'm going to send this over to Olivia, which is appropriate because I know you are dealing with some holly trees yourself. So their new home has 3 holly trees that are about 15 feet tall. Do they need to get a specialty arborist to remove them?
Yeah, that's a great question because I am dealing with some very similarly sized trees. One thing to think about is what is around your holly tree. Do you have power lines? Is there a fence? Are there other things that could be damaged that aren't your own or are infrastructure that would be damaged if those trees fell on them? And how skilled are you or your friends with a chainsaw? Because if you're pretty skilled with a chainsaw, it might be something you could do yourself. Because holly trees are often considered invasive trees, you don't need a permit usually, but you may want to check with the city that you live in, because some cities still want you to apply for a permit. But typically for invasive trees like holly, you don't need a permit, or the permit is free They just ask you to get a permit to make sure that you're following the rules in your city. But if you're able to do it yourself, there's no reason that you would have to hire an arborist if there's not other things that could be impacted if it fell. But it's those other things around you that could have impacts. And if you do cut them down, you are going to want to treat those stumps, because those holly trees will come back with a vengeance, with tons of little stems that come up right around that stump that you'll then have to battle as well. Hope that answers your question.
Advice from experience, I am sure. So they are a beginner chainsaw, so they're definitely not qualified. So I would definitely recommend reaching out to an arborist or a friend that might have some better experience there. I'll send this next question over to Eli. So what is the best way to get rid of nut grass in a flower bed? They don't mind starting completely over with new plants. They have tried to completely remove the soil and replace it, but they just must not have dug out enough nut grass, and because it keeps on coming back.
Yeah. So I'm gonna, Olivia and Tyler always step in, because nutgrass, I'm gonna say I've never personally controlled, but what I know about it is that it uses tubers and rhizomes to reproduce, which makes it challenging, like some of our other common weeds like this, like Italian arum, or lesser celandine for that matter, where removing all of the root material is going to be a monumental challenge, and it's going to be necessary to have complete eradication of the plant, which it sounds like you're trying to achieve. So not minding to start over with brand new plants is a good place to be at, because if you wanted to have 100% eradication, you might need to start over with new plants, remove the soil out of your flower bed, and potentially sift it. Sifting can be a method of just shaking that soil out and getting all the tubers, so that you can kind of quickly identify that you've gotten it all out. But unless all those tubers and rhizomes are out of the soil, you're not going to control it. So your hunch of thinking that you must not have dug all of them out is more than likely correct, especially because nutgrass, its reproduction through seed is kind of rare, as far as I know, that its primary method is through tubers. So I'd recommend going back and going through the soil and digging as much as you can. Probably not the answer you wanted to hear, but that's going to be the meticulous approach that it's going to require.
Awesome. Anything, go for it, Olivia.
Depending on the species of nutgrass that it is, some of them do produce viable seeds. So the seeds are very teeny tiny, and so sifting may not be the best option, because those seeds are very tiny and may go right through your sift. So I think your best option is probably to dispose of all that soil and bring in some good new soil and compost and start over.
Like Eli said, probably not the answer you want to hear, but might be the best way to just go ahead and start over. Great. Well, that is all of the questions that we have for this evening. But if any questions come up after the presentation, please feel free to reach out to myself or to the invasive species team who you just heard from. I will include this email address as well as all of their emails in that follow-up email, so you can just email them directly any questions that you might have, or forward it to me and I can pass it along to them, which I'm more than happy to do. I do want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I know I sure love to see it on a big screen for the first time. And thank you, and happy weed wrangling out there, everyone. Have a good night.